Disclaimer: I'm a law student, and the legal information provided is not legal advice. For that, please hire an attorney. Hi. Let's begin with a hypothetical. Let's say that you have a pretty small progressive leftist YouTuber. Let's say that this YouTuber has a background in law, policy, political science, and working with people in poverty. Hands-on experience, but not as much of a theoretical one. Let's say that this YouTuber starts a channel talking about her experiences in law school. Let's say that this YouTuber starts out without any particular plan or way that things are going to unfold, but eventually starts to figure out that her content and her audience is just naturally shifting to be more and more political, which isn't a bad thing. In fact, it's pretty neat. But let's say that very quickly and very rapidly, this YouTuber begins to learn that there's a lot more nuance than what she just learned about in the course of her political science degree, especially as it pertains to more leftist and progressive ideology. And let's say that while she is very strong in certain areas, in others she finds herself lacking. And then to add a twist on top of everything, let's say that in the different factions, ideologies, whatever you want to call them within this leftist space, that there is a lot of discourse, a lot of disagreement, very little unity. Question: what should this YouTuber do about this? So hey everyone, welcome back. I am free from my first year of law school. Hooray, joy, God, it's been a long 2 weeks, but I've been so excited to get back starting because again, I really like this. In case I can't stress it enough in the hypothetical, I do thoroughly enjoy doing this content, right? And I enjoy interacting with my audience, learning more as I go on. This is all a great experience, so I'm glad, and fortunately, I am very planned. I've got a long summer schedule ahead, but this seems like a good place to start. As many of you are probably aware, I am starting to shift much more towards political content, debates, discussions with other political commentators, talking about the current political climate, and so on. I am also very quickly finding myself out of my depth because right now I am engaging with a lot of conversation with people where I do have a lot to contribute. I know a lot about the law. I have a political science degree. I graduated with honors in political science. I do know my shit in a very general sense. But they don't teach you a lot about far left ideologies in colleges, even if that's what people like PragerU and all the far right hooligans want you to believe. They really don't. In fact, in my college, I went to a pretty, I don't want to say conservative, but conservative in the grand scheme of the world, liberal for where it was at. I went to a school down in Memphis, Tennessee that was liberal by Tennessee standards, but conservative by relativistic United States standards, right? So it's not like they taught me a lot about leftist ideology, and I have to learn a lot more, and I have a lot of catching up to do. So that's what we're doing today. I have a very special guest, another content creator, Zoomer Nation. They also do political content here on YouTube. We've interacted a lot, and from what I understand, they are very well versed in this kind of content, right? So we're going to, so I have a list of questions I want to go through, just talking about general ideologies. Some of this will be very familiar to a lot of you, some of it will not. And I want to talk about not only the ideologies, different factions like wokelets or the tankies or the dirtbag left. And I want to just talk about what we should as a larger movement do, but also what I should do, because I'm at sort of this very interesting point where it's not I've really taken any sides, right? I'm sort of the clean slate coming in here, right? So I want to make sure that what I do, I'm doing responsibly and thoughtfully. And so I'm very happy to have these conversations. And without further ado, Let's join the Discord. Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear.
Hey, what's up? How you doing?
Nothing much really.
Cool. So we are live. I already gave like a basic introduction, but do you want to introduce yourself to the audience just, so that you can frame yourself however you want to?
Yeah, sure. So, I'm Zoomer Nation. So I'm like an anarchist content creator, and so I look from an anarchist perspective with my political comment.
Okay, cool. So again, thank you so much for coming on. I sort of explained in the introduction that while I'm bringing obviously I am some flavor of progressive leftist. Obviously I agree with like a lot of the social values, but I am still figuring out myself, like sort of where I would fit in a lot of, these sort of like specific labels. Like you use anarchist to describe yourself. So at some point I'm going to want to talk about specifically what that means, right? Like I have a vague understanding from my degree, but I'm willing to bet that I do not know nearly as much as you do, since that's how you ascribe personally. So yeah, thank you so much for coming on. And do you mind if I sort of get the ball rolling? Like I have a ton of questions.
All right, that works.
Okay, cool. So I want to start with like some basic terminology. So like I guess like if we want to frame the whole, kind of what I want to cover, there's sort of like two different major categories, right? There are like the basic ideologies, so like socialism, communism, anarchism, if that's the correct description of them, how they overlap, and maybe even talking about like social democracy and seeing if that fits. And then later on, I want to talk about like sort of the informal, more social kind of factions like tankies, woke schools, and if we want to call it something, the dirtbag left. So I want to start. Can you give me like obviously everyone's socialist, and I've heard a bunch of different definitions of what socialism is. Can you give me like a basic running definition of what socialism is and what that would mean to organize society according to socialism?
Right. So if I were to give like a blanket phrase that would encompass like every socialist ideology, I would say workers owning the means of production is like fundamentally what socialism entails. So that could mean market socialism, that could involve like worker owned cooperatives, that can involve like no markets and people just cooperating and, you know, sharing the goods without competition. So essentially it all can be encompassed with workers owning the means of production. Like that's the fundamentals of all socialist ideology.
Okay, so that makes sense. I've heard Vosh describe it as sort of two elements, that being one of them, workers owning the means of production. And then I've also heard this other element where I think it's called the abolishment of the commodity forum.
Right.
Would
Yeah.
you agree that's a part of that then, like a working definition of socialism?
Yeah, I'd say that is, although that's like a very contested sort of perspective. Like some people
Mm.
think that the commodity form can sustain, but like that's more of something that's nuanced and like you can have different perspectives on that, I'd say.
Okay, so there can be socialists who do advocate very strongly for putting the means of production in the hands of the workers, but who don't necessarily argue, at least completely, if not sort of like on a more nuanced position, who don't argue that we should abolish the commodity forum. That's what you're saying.
Yeah, that's basically what I'd say.
Okay, so that makes sense. That pretty much checks out with what I got. The main question for me then is, how does that differ? Because I mean, like me as someone like I have a degree in political science. I thought I had studied this. That sounds very similar to what communism is, and I had a very different conception of what socialism is, sort of coming into leftist discourse. Like I had a very different understanding of what it was, and when I had talked to other people, they actually kind of described it the way that you just did, and I was usually like, no, I think it's actually pretty different. I think it's like I think that what they were describing and what you just described was communism, but it seems that I'm wrong. So, what is the distinction between socialism and communism then?
So essentially, communism exclusively talking about a stateless, moneyless, and classless society. Like that's the fundamental underpinnings of a communist society. Whereas with socialism, it depends. Like Marx used socialism and communism interchangeably, but
Hmm.
there's also socialists who predate Marx. There's socialists that believe in democratic socialism that want to preserve the state apparatus, who believe in profit and those are fundamentally contradictory to a classless, moneyless, and stateless society. So, like, communism entails socialism, but socialism isn't necessarily communistic in its nature.
Okay, so I mean, like that makes sense in theory. What would that look like? I know that people. I mean, like I know that there's discussion that like certain countries that have tried to be communist. Like usually the criticisms of communism come from people who will say that they will try to cite examples of countries in the past which have declared themselves as communists, and then usually communists like people who describe themselves as communists will be like, oh, that's not real communism, right? So what would a classless, moneyless society look like in practice? Because I'm having a hard time sort of envisioning that.
Right. So classless, moneyless, and stateless societies actually existed, but it was way back in the history books. So people just mutually shared the goods they had, and there was no need for a state apparatus. There's no need for a class structure. They just mutually benefited from each other and understood why we don't need markets. We don't need competition. We can just build off of each other.
Mm-hmm.
And so the reason why people bring up the fact that communism has never been tried before is because, like, the way communism was conceived by Marx, that really hasn't come into fruition in a post-industrial society, because it's very difficult to maintain a stateless, classless, moneyless society when you have imperialist capitalist forces. So there's some very fundamental things that need to happen first, and if you want, I can go through some of those.
Yeah, no, I'd really be interested because my immediate thought when I think about that is that, like, yeah, of course we used to live in a classless, moneyless society, but that seemed to be a symptom of a less developed civilization, right? Like that seemed to be like just me, right? And like, mind you, like I have what I lack in theory, I definitely make up for in like political psychology, right? And like if you look over the course of history, my first thought is that like, yeah, of course we didn't used to have a market because we used to live at such a point where we didn't really have a need for it, but eventually we sort of grew to a point in civilization where we needed to move beyond just like bartering with like I'll trade 3 chickens for your cow, right? So yeah, I would really like to hear like what would need to happen to like for us to want to as a civilization, as a society, to want to get back to that sort of state of existence, if that makes sense.
Right. So there'd have to be a transition where we first, seize the apparatus. We own the means of production, like the proletariat takes power. In Marxian terms, the proletariat is like the opposition to the bourgeoisie. They're the ones who sell their labor. They're the ones who, you know, have wages. They're essentially slaves to the ruling class. They'd have
Mhm.
to take power and seize control over the market. And ultimately, according to Marx at least, it would naturally lead to a stateless, classless, moneyless society, because without the binary struggle between two classes, without the competitive spirits of capitalism, fundamentally, there wouldn't be the same necessity for the state to exist. And it's human nature, according to a lot of literature, to just naturally get along. And the competitive market structure, to many philosophers and economists of the past who have a leftist perspective, they think that we don't need markets, we don't need that competition. It's just holding us back, and it's not what human nature is truly conducive to.
Okay, that I think that makes sense. I might push back on that. Well, I mean, like I might push back on it, and I might not. I do fundamentally agree. I agree with the psychological aspect that like we would need to get to a point in society where people were not like where the average person, right, was not fundamentally looking through a lens of where people were not fundamentally looking through a lens of competition and serving the self. Um, I'm not sure if we're quite there yet. I think that like I can see that argument. I think that if we look at a lot of European countries, the average person is a lot closer to there. Like I do see that. I'm not sure if that quite exists in America, and especially in like a lot of underdeveloped third world countries where you see a lot more people who are in sort of self-serving mindsets. Like I mean, like this is the reason why a lot of people who own corporations don't really give a shit about like polluting the earth and like destroying the planet, right? Because they don't care about other people. They care about lining their pockets as much as they can, right? And
Right.
like obviously that's an impeachment of their moral character, but I'm not sure if, but like they're not just an isolated incident, right? Like I think that's pretty stereotypical, or at least pretty common in an
Right.
American
And I
mindset, and like in a lot of parts of the world.
Right. And so I think that in order to finally create that mindset, that spirit of solidarity, you do
Mm-hmm.
have to build the frameworks, you need to strengthen unions, you need to
Mm-hmm.
create like the structures that help people. And that's why I thought Bernie Sanders was really important, unlike many communists. Many communists had the perspective that like we shouldn't engage in electoral politics at all. It's a waste of time. But I think Bernie Sanders helped create this sense of solidarity with working people. They felt as though they had this sense of uniqueness and connection with each other against Wall Street and the corporations. And I think that's a good sort of building block to ultimately create the framework and the mindset that's necessary to seize the means of production and try to reach a post capitalist society.
That makes a lot of sense. That makes a lot of sense because me, I mean, like right now, and this is actually something I'd like to ask you about in a little bit, but like understand that fundamentally I am operating from the position of like when I look at all issues in society, when I look at what I'm platforming, I always look through the lens of what policy could I practically implement today? Like, let's say that I ran for an office and I was put into like an office in Congress. What could I advocate for today to be able to resolve the issues that largely people who are either working class or of minority status or otherwise disenfranchised in society? What can I put on paper right now to help to like improve their living conditions? Right. So, like, I can totally, yeah, like I 100% can get behind like increasing the strength of unions. I feel like that's probably one of the best solutions available to us today to be able to help resolve the issues that a lot of workers face. And I suppose that's sort of like my one hang up when I hear people talk about, moving towards socialism. But if we're talking about it more, and actually, this is sort of the next question I had because this is something else I was wondering about as I watch people. So, for example, and I'm citing Vosh because I've watched his content, decently regularly. He has regularly said that he talks about decommodit or like putting the means of production in the hands of the workers, but he also usually caveats that idea by saying that's a long-term goal.
Right.
So my question then is like, if you say you are a socialist or a communist, is that a reflection of what you want to put into society today? Or is that a reflection of what you would like to achieve at some point in the far future?
So, like in an idealistic context, obviously, I would say today, like we do have the surplus goods. We have enough to feed the entire globe from a practical perspective. So clearly, we've accumulated enough resources at our disposal. But if I if I have to look at this practically, it has to be a long term goal because clearly millions of people are not ready for socialism. They still have a very negative connotation, a very negative perception with that word. So you have to build you have to educate, you have to build a foundation, you got to get people to try to mitigate the class struggle, give them health care, give them the basic needs. Unfortunately, some people don't take that part very seriously because they feel like if we give people health care, if we give people free education, they're not going to want to revolt anymore. And I think that's a really bad mindset because it shows that you're more obsessed with your abstract worldview than actually helping people. So I think that's really important.
That makes a lot of sense to me. And that's essentially where I feel like I would fall as well. Right. Like, of course, I care deeply about like like the health and longevity of us as a people and as a nation and as a world. But I first and foremost are like am concerned with like what can be done today to meaningfully and materially improve the lives of people. So yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Now, what I want to know, and I suppose this is like the last category, is can you go ahead and describe anarchism to me? Because this one is particularly interesting because I've seen people describe themselves as like both socialist and anarchist, or both communist and anarchist, and I'm trying to understand how, like, I would stereotypically assume these to be mutually exclusive categories. So can you tell me like why that overlap exists and what it is generally?
Well, to me, communism sort of implies anarchism because it's a
Mm,
stateless, classless, moneyless society. But anarchism,
mm,
there's various different ways people define it or interpret it. Like, I personally don't think that we can say, hey, we're against unjustified hierarchies. Like, that's the one definition people have, but it's too vague. Everyone is opposed to unjustified hierarchies, but that's really subjective. So, the way I define it is like opposing the state, opposing capitalism, and opposing all the major hierarchies that like undermine our abilities to be free and have autonomy. But at the same time, some level of coercion is necessary because otherwise you can't really organize a direct democracy, and we can't let a few people determine what policies. And there's going to be contradicting interests. So yeah, I basically define anarchism as opposing both capitalism and the state. And the way we organize an anarchist society is totally subjective, and it's dependent on what people want, essentially.
I mean, I guess that makes sense. I don't know. It seems extremely. I mean, like at that point, it seems like such a wide idea that almost anyone who is even somewhat leftist would, of course, identify as anarchist. Maybe that's the idea. I don't know. But like, that seems to go pretty hand in hand with people who have anti-capitalist sentiments. Then, so I don't know. I mean, like, makes sense. Sorry, go on.
Yeah, like the primary difference is like some people think the state as an entity is temporarily necessary before we can achieve our ideal society, whereas anarchists think that we need to abolish the state almost instantaneously once we begin the revolutionary process and try to achieve a decentralized sort of mechanism of operating society.
Can I entertain that line of thought? Like, what would that look like? This is another thing where, like, or maybe this is going back to like the communism discussion that we had earlier. But I have a very hard time conceiving, and I mean, like, of course, I would probably chalk this up to, like I am a product of my circumstances. I was born into a stated society. Like, this is all I've ever known. So I'm having a hard time conceiving of what a stateless society would look like, especially because I'm in law school and I'm literally learning all about like how we operate within the state of, the United States of America, right? So it's
Right.
it's very hard for me to conceive of that.
Yeah, so I think a good example historically would be, and it's still going on technically, so it's not historical really, but Rojava operates
Hmm.
within a concept called democratic confederalism. So essentially, it's like decentralized, and there's like different groups or communes or whatever you want to call it, and essentially they elect a delegate directly, and those delegates from the different decentralized areas get together and they help calibrate a broader goal, a broader aim to try to ameliorate the problems of society. And so essentially you still have coordination and collaboration to deal with huge crisis and stuff, but you also have the decentralized formation of society. So you directly elected delegates instead of having representatives. You make the decisions of what that delegate does. Like you are in possession of that delegate, and all the determinations they make is based on what the people want. That's essentially the distinction between like typical parliamentarianism or the US Senate and House of Representatives structure and the way an anarchist society would fundamentally function.
Okay, help me understand, because I'm thinking back again. I'm thinking back to my degree. How does that differ then from like, say, the Confederacy before the formal, before we had the Constitution? Like, how does this different from like, say, how we operated under the Articles of Confederation? Because right now, to me, it sounds very similar, and like a lot of those sort of structural organizations led to like serious problems for organization and like collective, advancement of the interests of like the entire nation.
Yeah, so there's 2 points there. The Articles of Confederation still technically maintain some vague level of state apparatus, but of course, even eliminating the state would be even worse in the context of the Articles of Confederation. But I think that one fundamental point that needs to be made is that anarchism is an international struggle. It's not predicated on this assumption that we need to build a nation state, which is why the Articles of Confederation was drafted. It was, post British colonialism. We need to establish the Americas. We need to build a framework for that kind of society. Whereas anarchism requires spontaneous, like international movements and efforts, and you can't just fight against the state. There's capitalism that needs to be taken into consideration. And another point that needs to be made is that even under the Articles of Confederation, you still elected state representatives. Like even if it's decentralized, there's still that representative democracy component of it. So the people still didn't have power. They couldn't make determinations that the legislators and the not parliamentarians, but the representatives could make.
How
Whereas
is
with
that
anarchism,
different? Like, how is that different from the state that you just, or from the place that you just described, the anarchist society? I thought that was what they did, was they elected representatives to go and like
uh,
converse with the other, areas.
the difference is that it's a direct delegation. So like every single decision that person makes is literally made by the people. So I can understand the pragmatic concern you'd probably have, right? Like, how do you get a society where every single decision is direct democracy? Would that be like one of the grievances you have? Like,
Uh, I mean, like for me, it's figuring out the alternative, right? Because I mean, if we're having a society which is fundament like what you just described to me sounded like a form of representative democracy. If people elect, like if you have different areas where people elect officials to go and converse with the other elected officials of like other similar areas, that just sounds like the same thing as the Articles of Confederation to me without the same language, just intuitively. And I'm trying to, and I understand that you're saying that there's a difference. I'm just trying to suss out what that difference is, right? Like materially. I understand that they're not called the same things, but like I'm not necessarily looking for like, I'm looking more objectively, right? Like I'm trying to suss out like what they do, if that makes sense. Like what do they do that's
Right.
materially different?
Right. So with the Articles of Confederation, once you elect that representative on a state by state basis, they still supersede the people in their power, and so their determinations still aren't contingent on what the people want necessarily. Whereas with an anarchist society, once you elect a direct delegation, that delegate, it's not even electing. It's like it's like they like circulate. Like they choose one delegate after another. It like flips person to person, and that delegate has to do every single thing that people want collectively. And once they're like moving around and talking and discussing with other delegates, they go back to the people, and the people collectively decide what the delegate is going to act upon. So it's like very different from like the more representative style democracy where it's kind of separate between what the people want and what the elected representative wants,
But isn't
essentially.
that supposed to be? I mean, like again, a constitution, like a oh, I'm trying to remember, like an originalist of the Constitution. Like this was a conversation that had happened at the Constitutional Convention where they like specifically implemented the electoral system with the idea that like by making it so that officials were elected, that they would have to adhere to the whims of their constituents, or else if they didn't, then they would just be elected out. So
That's a good point, and here's how I'd answer. The distinction is that as long as a capitalist framework exists, there's the federal society, like the federal government, is way preferable to state government because here's why. Once a large corporation takes power, once private capital, gets a hold of a sort of system, it would obviously be harder to take a hold of a federal government than like a small state government. And so fundamentally, I think that operating within a capitalist framework is different because if as long as capitalism exists, I prefer a federal government over a state government because the people can't democratically elect corporate boards. They can't democratically elect CEOs. So the federal government is what gives them a chance to give their voice to some degree or another. So I think I delineate the difference between like capitalist framework and non-capitalist framework when it comes to the Constitution. Because James Madison, this is an interesting fact. He actually went against Aristotle's original conception of democracy because
mm,
he wanted only rich landowner. I think you know this one. He wanted rich landowners to be able to vote, but nobody else. That's because he knew that massive amounts of inequality would drive poor people nuts, and they tried to revolt against the system. So he tried to centralize it and make it so that you can vote, but you have to be wealthy, you have to be landowning, and that's how the democracy functioned essentially.
yeah, no, and I mean that makes sense, and that's a very valid criticism. We don't have, I mean, we don't operate with that framework anymore, right? I mean, people from, well, I mean, like I guess that you could make the argument, right? Like you do need to have. I'm trying to remember the requirements or some of the formal requirements. One of them, I believe, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe that one of them is that you need to own property, right, or at least some form of property. Again, people can feel free to correct me if I'm wrong on that. I'm just guessing off the top of my head. I know that there are other some I know that there are a lot of barriers to be able to cast your vote in an electoral system in general, right? Like I understand that. And I do agree that we should try to abolish as many of those barriers as possible, right? Like for example, I know that like a large discussion that's happening right now is the rights of prisoners to vote, right? And obviously I completely agree with abolishing those prohibitions on prisoners to be able to vote in elections, right? Like I feel like that's taking a massive amount of population, disproportionately people of color, disproportionately people who are poor, and you're just preventing them from being able to vote in like significant electoral systems. I don't necessarily see that as a problem which requires a complete revision or a complete abolishment of the current system. That seems to me to be more like a problem that can be solved like with standard revision through like the systems that we already have.
Okay, so a few points to make.
Mm-hmm.
As long as a centralized state exists, there's always going to be some hurdles to democracy and people having their wills heard, because by definition, the state exists above the people, because it essentially has jurisdiction over the people. It
Mm.
arbitrates laws and determinations that stands above the people. The judiciary, the legislative branch, they all essentially stand above the people, and they formulate the social contract in order to create a framework for which the people can live in. And the social contract isn't as bad as the rest of the state apparatus as a concept. But
Mm.
I'd say that, to me, fundamentally, philosophically speaking, I oppose the idea of a centralized body coercing the rest of the population and the state standing above the people. Like, that's my fundamental philosophical grievance. And all the problems about voting restriction, that's more of like a symptom of the problem than like the primary issue I have.
Yeah, no, I mean, like, and I get that. Again, this goes back. I mean, like, I literally just took con law one. This is actually really interesting because it's very pertinent. I mean, like, there's been a long conversation since like the beginning of the founding of our country about like the amount of power to allocate to the states versus the federal government, right?
Right.
Um, One of the biggest, I mean, like, especially if you look at something like the Commerce Clause, right? Historically speaking, like the vast majority of the legislation that comes out of Congress gets its authority constitutionally from the Commerce Clause, right? And one of the major considerations for the Commerce Clause as to whether or not the federal government can legitimately execute that law. Again, I'm just saying from my perspective as a law student, from having learned this, disclaimer, hypothetical, yada yada.
Right.
Um, but one of the major considerations is whether or not, well, I suppose that there's several considerations. A, whether or not the state is already or states are already regulating that specific area, or whatever it may be. And then secondly, if they are regulating it, if it's an issue which requires uniformity across the entirety of America, or if it's something which is more localized and should be left to more local, delineation and local determination and regulation, right? So when you talk about like the idea that you're opposed to a larger centralized government, I can't help but think like, okay, then what's going to keep people who are racist from doing racist things and discriminating against race, then discriminating against people who aren't white, right? Like that's an area where, yeah, there's a larger centralized government which is impeding on someone's rights, right? But it's impeding on someone's rights to like discriminate against someone. And that seems like a more justified infringement of personal liberty to me.
Well, so there's a few points that need to be made. So if we're gonna operate within the framework of, American history and like the way America has developed over time, I'd obviously like side with federalism more than like democratic republicanism. I'd definitely agree more with Alexander Hamilton than, people that were more libertarian and against banking and so on and so forth.
Mm.
Because as I said earlier, the capitalist structure is really problematic. You need the centralized state as long as capitalism exists to mitigate some of the errors and the flaws. But as far as the relationship between decentralization and centralization is concerned, I think that we must operate within an intersectional perspective rather than a reductionist perspective.
Mm.
So, in order to ultimately achieve anarchism, you brought up racism and so on and so forth. I think that we need to have a intersectional coalition globally. We
Mm.
shouldn't be focused on the white working class. We should be focused on people like collectively who have been oppressed. And I think rhetoric is a big part of that. I think that trying to support, as long as the state does exist, trying to support anti-discrimination measures, trying to create the consciousness and the social tolerance. I think before we get to an anarchist society, those are fundamental. And I think that framework we need to operate under. So that's what I'd say.
Yeah, no, and I mean like I completely agree with that. This is the thing for me, because so far, I mean like it seems like functionally as far as like things to implement today, like I don't really like again like this is the thing that's been sort of irking me for as I've been researching more and more. There's not been a single policy position like as far as what you would want to do today that I have disagreed with you on whatsoever, right? Again, like we can have lots of discussions about like what we should do in the future once society gets to a certain point and we need, we address certain new issues. But like as far as like, creating coalitions to be able to advocate for the rights of minority persons or being able to advocate or create better systems to be able to help people who are working in the world and to be able to decrease regulations and inhibition and prohibitions on people who are trying to be able to vote and who otherwise are prohibited, right? Like these are all things that we fundamentally agree on, right? And so,
Yeah. So
yeah, go on.
like I think the main like misconception that we're having here is like I think that you're struggling to see why we'd have a decentralized society that's successful. And I can understand why from the historical lens. The Articles of Confederation were a total disaster. If the Articles of Confederation existed, George Washington wouldn't be able to take down the Whiskey Rebellion and people protesting redistribution and so on and so forth. So I get that perspective, which is why I think that the building part is more important than how we build up to that end goal is more important than that end goal right now, because we need to make a society where we end the perverted incentives of capitalism. We need to totally end the racism of the drug war and purging voter rolls of African Americans and minority voters. All of that first needs to be addressed before we work together to fight back against these hierarchies. That's what I think is really important.
Yeah, and I tend to agree. Okay, that answers a lot of the questions sort of in that area. I guess that the last one that I have is, so those seem to be a lot of, so we've just discussed a lot of like the far left or like furthest left sort of political ideologies, at least generally. How would you define a social democrat? Because I have to confess, because I am operating, like for me it's been hard because there's a distinction between defining myself politically according to the policies I want to implement today. And then there's also, but like there's a difference in how I would define myself according to that criteria and like defining myself according to what I think would be important to implement down the line and like a further, part of the future, right? Right now, as we've discussed, I sort of have a higher priority on things that we can implement in like a market system or like a democratic system like what we have today. But I also acknowledge that like once we get to a certain point in human development, then yeah, like other forms of government will be, certainly viable and probably will need to be implemented. So how does the label or how does the ideology of like social democracy fit in this discussion?
So we also have to understand like social democracy means different things depending on the region. Like for example, I'd say Bernie Sanders is way to the left of like Norwegian social democracy that still has a no minimum wage, massive private sector, very little taxation. I very much distinguish to some degree or another European social democracy with American social democracy, like FDR style social democracy.
Mm-hmm.
But the reason why I don't call myself a social democrat, even though technically I want to implement these reforms, is because many of these reforms, first of all, aren't really that social democratic. Like I want to build cooperatives, worker-owned cooperatives, and the end goal would be to try to create an economy where workers totally own the means of production. So like the social democratic policies I want to implement now serve a greater purpose in the future that'll help workers even more. So that's why I don't really call myself a social democrat, even though right now in this current political stage, I support many of their reforms.
That makes a lot of sense, actually, and that pretty much checks out what I've been learning about. Later on, after we're done talking, I'll probably do a little discussion because I probably find myself leaning, at least just like based on the policies that I want to implement today, as more of a social democrat. And also, if I ever run for political office and I identify as like anything further left than that, then I will be destroyed for it. So that's probably another practical consideration of mine. People can ascribe me labels otherwise as they will. But that makes a lot of sense, and that pretty much checks out with what I was thinking. Okay, I think that pretty much covers everything from like that part of the discussion. Do you have anything that you want to recover or anything that you want to revisit before we move on to the next area I want to talk about?
I think we're good. I think we covered everything.
Okay, awesome. So that's a pretty good, I mean, that, obviously there's like a lot more nuance in those areas, but that pretty much clears up a lot of my questions for those areas generally. I want to move to sort of leftist online discussion since this is a bit more closer to home. We're sort of in the middle of it, right? And so I want to ask you about a couple of groups of people, and we can move through them one at a time. The tankies, the wokelets or woke schools or whatever you want to call them, and the debate bros, right? So first, I have a basic understanding of tankies, but can you sort of explain the your understanding to me?
Yeah, I'd say people who fetishize Joseph Stalin, Mao Zedong, uncritically praise their regimes without any nuanced analysis, I'd say that tankies would constitute that. And I've also noticed that these tankies they've been very anti breadtube lately. Like they feel
Mm.
really alienated by breadtube. They feel as though their voices are not being heard. So yeah, I just make an additional comment to that.
Why do you think that they're more alienated?
I think that they don't like the fact that a lot of bread tubers have totally dismissed them. Like they're tankies. Who cares? And they feel as though the establishment is against them. That's what I've noticed from a lot of these people that call themselves tankies or tankies. They feel as though bread tube is radical liberal. They focus too much on intersectionality and identity politics, and they wish we can get to the class struggle. That's all that matters. That's like the mainstream view I've seen from a lot of tankies.
Is that what people say when they're talking about like class reductionism? I've heard that term a lot, but I'm not entirely clear on what that means.
Yeah, so class reductionism technically means oh sorry class
Mhm.
reductionism technically means that you reduce every issue to class, whether it be race, gender. You think fundamentally it's class that's the driving force that makes these issues so problematic.
Hmm.
But I'd say that nowadays class reductionism is like thinking that class is fundamentally so important that all the other issues we can focus on them later. We can set them aside. I think that's how class reductionism manifests in this modern internet
Mm.
era. So
Gotcha.
yeah,
So it's more, I mean, like it has this like fundamental framework, but it also like practically has the effect of like pushing all other discussions, especially discussions of intersectionality, to sort of the side. Like, hey, this is what matters. The rest of that stuff, that's not as important. We need to be talking about this right now.
yeah, pretty much.
Okay, that makes sense. Why? Like, I gotta ask, like, why would people want to like fetishize Stalin? That does not seem like a good take. That seems like implicitly, again, I'm going off my like very basic understanding, but like that seems like a bad take.
Right. So I think they have a very like pro leader, pro authoritarian complex, like many
Mm,
conservatives have. So I think they like the fact that Stalin had an iron grip over the country. They love the Soviet propaganda. We all love that theme song. The music's really great, but I think the optics, in addition to revisionist history, I think really drives people to loving Stalin and being really into the Soviet Union. I think we all know those people. They have this not the swastika, the hammer and sickle t-shirt, and they're pro Stalin, and I think we all know that caricature. And so yeah, that's what I think is the driving force though.
I mean, that's interesting. It's kind of, I don't know. Would it be unfair to analogize them very closely to people who are really supportive of Trump? Like, would that be unfair? Because, like, right now, I'm thinking of like functionally the same sort of mindset where they don't really care so much about like the practicability and like the actual effects that policies will have, but they care more about the optics of the person that they want to be in charge.
Right, the dear leader kind of complex, and
Hmm.
they make Trump look way better than he actually is. So
Yeah,
that's definitely
interesting. Okay, I mean that definitely helps me. It gives me a much better perspective of the people that we're working with. Yeah, so very helpful. Okay, so can you tell me a little bit, like like I know a little bit about this Discord because I taught about this discourse from my videos on like Xander Hall and Essence of Thought. But can you just sort of give me, excuse me, can you give me your like opinions or thoughts on like woke scolds or wokelets?
right. So I used to be a woke scold. In fact,
Mm-hmm.
probably one of the more prominent ones, but I'd say that they're driven by this desire for justice. They have really good intentions, but the way they go about it is trying to harass people online, calling them fascist, calling them like various sorts of names, and trying to do social justice activism in a very cathartic way, very emotionally driven way, instead of trying to, have a rational discussion and trying to, persuade Vosh or Xanderhall, like, hey, maybe we shouldn't use the R slur. Instead, I think they're more interested in like slinging mud and creating this adversary in BreadTube. Like, I think that's the main intentions they have.
Yeah, and I'm inclined, like I definitely see the evidence and I see the reasoning behind that. So do you see them as more, because I, from their perspective, just from like my interactions with people who other people might describe as woke scolds or wokelets, they would probably describe themselves as like people who are speaking truth to power and are, trying to call out the problems on the, the progressive left on breadtube. They don't want to see certain problems creep up in their community. Do you think that there's any truth to this, or do you think that they're more operating from this mindset like what you were describing, where it's they more care about like just trying to create an enemy out of people who are in this community?
I'd say it's both. Like, I'm sure many of them genuinely just have legitimate grievances. I mean, I think the way they take the legitimate grievances is like the main problem, like the way they try to deal with it. But like some of it is exaggerated. Like, I don't know if you heard about the whole Vosh black nationalism thing.
I've
Like
been following.
yeah, I think they sort of misconstrue Vosh's position a little bit, and they take out the context that he's talking to a really radical person, if I'm not mistaken.
Mhm.
So I think that they take away nuance and context, and I feel like they try to isolate a particular word or language or rhetoric and try to make it worse than it actually is. And sometimes they have legitimate grievances. Like, I don't agree with everything Xanderhal says. There's a lot I disagree with. There's a lot I disagree with someone like Peter Coffin, but I'm sure they can have a conversation. I'm sure that they can sort out these problems without being aggressive or overly hostile.
Right. And I mean, like, I will confess that that's sort of like if I'm just interjecting my own opinion, that's sort of where I come from, right? Because like when I was starting to make content on like that dispute, it actually like again, like I am small YouTuber, right? And I fully acknowledge that, and I'm very aware of my position, relative to other creators on this platform. I made the videos in like the hope that it would get some attention, but I didn't expect it to get nearly the amount of attention that it did. And then I ended up not being able. I didn't in the end speak to Essence of Thought, like in person, or I mean over video, over voice, whatever. Although I did like tweet with them and have messages between them. But I was able to go onto Xanderhall's stream, and now I've spoken with Xanderhall several times. And like the first time when I spoke with him, I brought up a lot of my grievances, and I don't think, as far as I'm aware, again, people can correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm pretty sure that since then he hasn't used like ableist language. So
Oh,
it,
he's used a few.
oh really?
A few,
Uh,
yeah. But I'm
well,
for sure he's cut it down.
if he has, then I got no. I have nothing for that. I have nothing for that.
No,
But
it's
it was
okay. I mean, I think he's improved, yeah.
yeah. But that's the point, is that like I don't see these people as a lost cause, and I also do take consideration. Actually, this might be a better place to sort of like shift into the larger discussion. We already talked about this a little bit, but let me just ask you ask you your opinion. Like, where do you stand on like the dirtbag left? Like, it seems to be just like Vosh and Xanderhall and maybe Destiny, from what I understand. But like, is there anyone else, and is there anything that like? Do you have any particular thoughts on them?
Um, I'm fine with being edgy and contrarian, and not contrarian, but like being aggressive when you're dealing with like fascist and trying to use particularly, you know, controversial rhetoric to try to bring in chuds. But I think sometimes the left is way too excessive.
Mm,
I think that because you're in the moment, because there's this fight or flight reaction sometimes when you're having this kind of debate and discourse, they say things that they might regret later on. So I think it's like a very nuanced sort of conversation to be having. Like, I don't think they're good or bad. Like, I have mixed opinions.
that makes sense, and that's, I think, very fair. Um, do you have? I'm trying to think of the right way to word this. Do you have any possible recommendations for them, or do you have any possible, like, let's say that you wanted to do certain things, like things X, Y, and Z, and then they didn't do those things, and because they didn't do those things, then you would hold them more accountable. Like, what would you want to see them do in
Well,
order
this
to
is
try
gonna
and improve themselves?
yeah, this is gonna sound kind of cliche, but like it kind of ties into the whole debate me, bro type stuff that's been going
Mm-hmm.
on lately. I think that there's nothing wrong with admitting that you're wrong. Like, I think that's a good thing. Like, don't feel as though admitting that you're wrong on a lot of issues like that suddenly negates your abilities as a debater, or that negates your abilities as a intelligent person. Like, there's nothing wrong with that. And I know a lot of controversial issues where people like to double down And they do the opposite of what Thought Slime did in that one video. I forgot the exact details, but like I think that there's nothing wrong with like trying to reconcile or deal with the past problems you've dealt with and like trying to make amends or whatever, to be
Mm.
honest.
Yeah. No, and I mean I get that. Actually, I suppose this is a good question or a good segue into like a side question that I have. Because I'm still figuring this out. I did a poll on my Twitter the other day where I asked what kind of content people would want to see more, and the number one voted choice was debates, and I was like, oh shit. Because I kind of worry about people starting to, and I mean, like, again, there's nothing necessarily good or bad about it, right? But I wonder if people will start, like, if I do engage in more debates, and I have to think about how I want to go about that ethically, right? Like, I'm not sure if I want to just go around challenging people to debates, right? I feel like that's probably one of the places where people take the most issue, just from like where I'm sitting in this discourse. But it does sort of raise this question of like, how ethical do people see like debate as a way to do content, right? Because like for me,
Right.
I'm coming from the position that like this is literally what this is literally what I've been trained for, for a good part of my life. Like I literally did debate for 4 years in undergrad. I coached for a while after. Now I'm in fucking law school. So forget my language, but like, this is content which not only do I feel very strongly about as far as like my ability to perform, but like it's also content which I just enjoy, right? Like I enjoy talking to people, and sometimes I get to wipe the floor with them, and sometimes that's fun. If it's people who I thoroughly disagree with, and otherwise I just get to have like great conversations, which is why I'm a little unsure about whether or not I'm going to classify this as a talk or a debate. I'm still figuring that out. So far, I'm very much enjoying myself, and I hope that you are as well. Yeah, it's just I'm in this weird position where I'm not sure if I'm gonna end up just sort of naturally, if I follow the progression, be termed as a debate bro, debate sis, debate
Yeah.
girl. I don't know.
Yeah, I get you. I mean, I think that you don't want to go too far into like the Destiny route where like he's so interested in debating to the point where, he wants to make the enemy look bad and he's going to say really asinine things. Like he compared a leftist to a Nazi, I think, in one of his
Mm,
recent videos. Like, I think that sometimes to go for the clicks, to get people to rally behind you, you oftentimes use hyperbolic rhetoric or misrepresent certain things. And I think that you need to be careful like with how you go about debating, but like I think debating is a very important way to like try to ascertain what ideas are better than others and who's full of shit and who isn't, that's also important.
yeah, that definitely makes sense. I don't know. If I go on debating people, and I certainly hope that people will paint me in a charitable light and will enjoy my content, and, see me as like fundamentally, I do want to make clear, right? Like I care a decent amount about how other people see me, and I like being acknowledged positively. Like recently, I'm not sure if you saw, but there was this video that Creationist Cat, or
Yeah, I saw.
that he released, and it was so cool. Even though I wasn't like mentioned a ton, it was so cool just being able to be acknowledged as like a part of that. And actually, it's led into a really cool sort of interact, like a series of interactions between me, him, and like a bunch of other leftist creators, right? Including like a shout out from the Surfs, which was amazing. I was like, oh my god, this is the coolest thing. And I'm actually going to be having Creationist Cat on this channel next week, so that's going to be really cool, right? But the point is that I want to make sure that, as I'm going through this content, as I'm going through how I'm creating my content, that I'm doing so in a way which not only is something which makes me happy and satisfies sort of my needs as, a creator to do content that I'm genuinely interested in, but also to do so in a way which the general leftist community is supportive of, right? Again, I probably don't care about the opinions of people who are like tankies. I can tell you based on our conversation that I am probably not serving their interests, just based on what we have talked about, my general knowledge of them. But like, as far as like you and other creators, like I do want to make sure that I'm doing things responsibly, right? So that's my main concern.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So I guess I'll bring up sort of my last question sort of on that front. And this is sort of like the last like nuts and bolts issue that I want to get into. Do you think that there's any possibility, like any realistic possibility for like mediation with these different people on the left? For example, like you referenced Vosh and his drama with black nationalism. I know that Xander Hall recently had a lot of drama with like dating and his Discord.
Sex work, yeah.
Yeah. And do you think that there, and obviously, like, there's also the tankies and people who would be described by others as like woke schools or wokelets, and then there's like the different factions. Like, do you think that there's any way to get like unity or at least solidarity on the left?
Yeah, but like there's some people that I think can't get along. Like obviously tankies probably won't get along with a typical, leftist because there's totally different operating principles and like ideas and all that. So, but I still think solidarity is important because, when fascism is such a serious problem in this modern era, you need a left that can have solidarity and operate within this agreement that we have this greater evil that we need to face off against and set aside our massive ideological differences regarding the state or the validity of the Soviet Union or whatever, and still like try to fight back against these fascistic forces because once fascism takes power, the left is essentially destroyed. So not destroyed like in its totality, but like the leftist organizing is undermined to a very profound degree. So yeah, that's what I'd say.
No, and I tend to agree, right? Like, for me, especially right now when we're talking about, and I mean, like, we don't have to talk a lot about this subject. Like, this can be a huge discussion in and of itself, but like the difference between voting for Biden and Bernie for bust, obviously, this is like a large talking point that a lot of people bring up on this issue, is whether or not, like, like, Biden is a terrible person, but is voting for a terrible person who somewhat shares your beliefs at least preferable to voting for someone who's like an outright like pseudo or like proto fascist, and who also doesn't have to worry about impeachment, and who also is going to be able to put in another Supreme Court justice, and who also has explicitly advocated against minority rights and policy.
Right.
Like, it's
So
it's yeah.
out of curiosity, do you think that so when you say proto-fascist, do you like think that he's not quite like an actual fascist? Like,
I don't think he's nearly that thoughtful. When
okay.
like so for me, I look at this again through sort of like a political psychology sort of lens. I think that, so like and again, we don't have to talk a whole lot about this. This relates to sort of how I look at a lot of politics through like a spiral dynamics model of psychological development. I would see him essentially operating at the same kind of capacity or the same kind of mindset as like Genghis Khan and like other conquerors, like people who don't necessarily think a whole lot about what they do, but instead just kind of rule by might and do what they want and say screw all to the people who want to try to tell them to do whatever they want. Like, that's a pretty stereotypical figure in history if you look at a lot of like much older conqueror minded or conqueror oriented sort of leaders throughout history, right? So
Yeah,
I'm yeah, go on.
oh, go ahead. Sorry.
Or I was just gonna say, and like that is very different from like a fascist mentality, but like if you look at the historical sort of trends, like that, like societies that are organized around that mentality have a real predisposition to end up going towards fascism, right? And so yeah, like I don't necessarily see him as fascist, but like obviously by virtue of his presence in national politics, I think that he has made it much more viable and much easier for fascism to develop like in the underbelly of our society, and increasingly like in the broad daylight of our society.
Right. Like, I'd say that vaguely speaking, he has some similarities with fascism. Like, the idea of rebirth is really critical to fascist theory,
Mm.
paleogenesis, the idea that we need to rekindle this 1950s spirit. But usually fascists go way back in time, white nationalism and so on and so forth. But I would agree with you, like, he's not extreme enough to the point where it's okay or fair to describe him as a fascist. But I understand why many leftists have this tendency to call him a fascist because he is very reactionary and pretty far right, I'd say.
Yeah, no, I mean, like there's no dispute that like Trump is like very like one of the furthest right. Well, I'm not sure actually. I don't know, I need to think more about that, but like an extremely far right president, right? And yeah, it's like, again, he hasn't been, well, I don't know. I mean, like people might be able to make like a fun argument, or fun heavy quotes, with ICE and like keeping kids in detention camps. I feel like there might be some sort of argument to be made there, but otherwise, yeah, I'm not sure if I'm not sure if he crosses the overt threshold of fascism. But he definitely makes it much easier for fascism to spread, right? Like, for example, with oh, Unite the Right in Charlottesville, where he
Right. Yeah.
described those people in like overtly positive or at least neutral ways, right? Like it's like an implicit, uh, it's like an implicit, oh, what's the word? Support, acknowledgement. You know, it's an implicitly positive reaction to people who otherwise should be like condemned by the president of the fucking United States of America, right?
Yeah, I think Unite the Right made me a little bit skeptical about whether or not he's a fascist, but like
Mm,
I think a fascist in the United States in this current period of time would fearmonger about demographic changes, talk about why we need a white majority. I think someone like Tucker Carlson, I could see them being a fascist if they took power,
mm.
but like yeah, I see how Trump is building the he's enabling another fascist to take power or somebody way worse to take power. I think that's really serious and problematic. So yeah.
I tend to agree with that. I do tend to agree with that, and I think that in the future, and this is why I don't know. I need to read up more on accelerationism. I mean, like again, I don't know as much about it. I know that there are some ways that people say that it's helpful. I just want to make sure that we don't end up putting into government like an actual fascist, right? Because
Right. Yeah.
that will, like you said, right? Like it would be very counterintuitive to the interests of people who are further left because like the first thing that they're going to do is quash any resistance to their interests as, you know, a stated society, right? So yeah, to the extent that like that type of accelerationism is something that people advocate for, my first thought is to not advocate for that. um yeah, but that makes a lot of sense. Okay, that actually wasn't where I was hoping to go, but I guess that makes a lot of sense. And I suppose that, you know, the best way I would sort of want to put a cherry on that is to say that, like, you know, whereas, like, the reason that we don't want that type of accelerationism and we don't want to put a fascist in government, like an overt fascist, is because we do want to make sure that, like, not only are they unable to quash the efforts of people who are further on the left, but we want to make sure that, like, they're not able to quash like something that we've meaningfully built, right? And it's hard to say. I mean, like obviously we're further along, I would say, than we have been historically. At least as far as like, you know, being able to have a platform and being able to like broadcast these sort of ideas and being able to bring other people to sort, you know, to this sort of thinking, right? Like I think that we're at a very good place for that, assuming that YouTube doesn't change its fucking rules and start just like offering political
Yeah.
channels, right? That would not be great. Going over to D Live then, but
D Live is like right now. D Live is like a Nazi cesspool. I'm pretty sure, but
yeah, I know.
you won't have a choice though if
Exactly. And I mean,
YouTube's
like YouTube
Nazi.
was like that before a lot of leftists started joining. So, you know, it's just, I don't know. To me, it's just starting from the same position. But anyway, so I do want to make sure that we actually get to a point where we have something sort of meaningfully worth protecting, right? As of this moment, I see a lot of people who are on the left in these sort of different categories that we've discussed so far. And, you know, you have some decent solidarity and decent agreement on a lot of certain issues, especially like socially related issues, I would say. Like a lot of people seem to agree that like discrimination is wrong and we should give people equal rights and we shouldn't discriminate and, you know, like things like that, right? Like I think that we're pretty on the same page as far as social issues go. And then a lot of the economic issues as well, sort of going back to our discussion earlier, at least on what to implement today, right? Like I think that a lot of people are in agreement about like what kinds of policies would be good to see, like if someone were to go into Congress like tomorrow.
I'm a bit skeptical actually when it comes to the social issues element because
Hmm?
I have noticed that some polling data indicates that like the newest generation seems to have dipped a little bit when it comes to overall aggregate tolerance towards the LGBT community, and there is
I've
some
seen
things
people
that
talk
I
about that.
but at the same time, I do think that overall we are going towards the positive trajectory. So yeah, I'd probably agree with you.
Yeah, and
We
no, and I
we
mean
have
I agree with that. Well, I would also say that like I believe I've seen people talk about that, and that has to do largely with people who are uh like in their late teens to early 20s who are cis and male, right? So like it's a very
yeah
specific demographic, right? And that might have something to do with like the rise of fascism and like far right thinking among younger generations, which is another problem, which is why we should
yeah.
have more leftist creators and more solidarity because we need more shit to combat that, right? Like that's not
Yeah.
good. It's very
I mean,
not good.
the online left has improved a lot because
Mm,
now you've noticed the right is the one that's afraid to debate us, whereas it used to be like, oh, the left can't debate, the left is
mm.
scared, and now suddenly right wingers are like, oh my god, I don't want to debate some of these people.
Right. No, and I totally agree. I wonder if they think of me as such a person. It's actually interesting because recently, and I'll just say this and then we can end it because this is just like a funny point to me. Someone recently messaged me on, I think it was Instagram. This was shortly after my debate with Mars on Ariel Scarcella, right? In the video that he did. And actually, it was an Ariel Scarcella fan. And what they said was very interesting to me. And they, I said that so first they challenged me to a debate. They were very formal. They were nice about it. So I can't really say anything bad about them in that respect. But what she said was that whereas, she was very specific to use the language that whereas she thought that other people were afraid to debate me, she was going to try and actually have a conversation with me. And I just thought that was very interesting because it means that not only has she been talking with other people in the community, like Ariel's community, about the debate I had, but that other people are scared to debate me about it. And I'm just like, damn.
Yeah, that's pretty funny.
Yeah. So no, I do tend to agree, right? It is good that we have sort of a presence where it shows that we're able to debate, because that means that not only are we a group that is viable at defending our positions, right? But it also shows that we are a group, a at least political coalition, if we want to use that sort of terminology, which is able to advocate for our ideas in such a way where other people who reject those ideas really don't have anything to say about it at the end of the day, except for they just don't like it. They can't resort to some idea like, oh, it's impracticable. Oh, it's too idealistic. Oh, it's too, what's the word? When you describe the perfect society, I'm having a brain fart here. Yeah, it's too utopian. We're able to address those ideas and show people no, they're practicable and they're realistic and we can do them now. I think that's such a powerful thing to do. So yeah, I'm really excited to see that sort of thinking progress more going into the future. Yeah, but all right. I think that pretty much answers all my questions. Do you have anything else that you want to talk about, or do you want to start wrapping up?
I think I can wrap it up.
Okay, cool. Do you want to shout out yourself, shout out your channel, social media, all that?
Yeah, sure. It's Zoomer Nation. That's my YouTube channel, and yeah, my Twitter. You can look up. I think it's at Sarma/UTSAV. That's my name. So yeah.
All right, wonderful. Well, hey, thank you so much for coming on. And yeah, if you ever want to hit me up. And this was a great conversation. Again, I don't know whether or not to list this as a debate or as a discussion, because I've very much enjoyed myself. I hope that you have as well. And yeah, let's do it again sometime. All right.
Yeah, sure. Thanks.
Yeah, no problem. Bye.